Have you ever thought about using a bond ladder to create income in retirement? Well, here to talk with us about that topic is Amy Shepard from Sensible Money. Amy, welcome.
Hi, Bob. Thank you so much.
Oh, pleasure to have you back, and it would be a pleasure to have you walk us through how these bond ladders work.
Yes, well, at Sensible Money, that is the only approach that we use when we are talking about retirement decumulation and how to invest your portfolio. So, the big thing I think to start off is just to know that all those years that you've diligently saved and you tucked money away into your retirement accounts, that part's a little bit easier. You set the money aside and you don't really think about it too much until you get to retirement. And when you get to retirement and you have to start living off of those acorns, it's a totally different approach. And the bond ladder approach is one of many. There's a ton of different strategies on how you should invest your portfolio for your retirement years, but we're going to talk specifically about the income ladder or bond ladder approach today.
Right. So, what's the first step in creating a bond ladder?
So the first step is to put together a comprehensive retirement plan. What that means is, going through the process of mapping out your income and your expenses throughout retirement. Sounds so simple, right? But it's a pretty big task to try to make assumptions on what your income and what your spending is going to look like over, 30 or 40 years. But it is worth the time and the effort to do that because one of the things I always like to say is that in general, life is not linear. That applies to retirement planning. So, in retirement, your income is not the same. What it starts with is not necessarily what it's going to look like throughout retirement. Same with your expenses. What I mean by it not being linear is like, say you're starting to plan for your retirement and you are still working. Well, you might have a salary and that's pretty steady and predictable. Then you retire and maybe you aren't going to start Social Security right away, or you have a pension, but that's not going to start right away. Then that means that you may have several years where there's no income sources. All of your spending has to be supported by your savings. Then eventually, Social Security kicks in. If you're lucky, a pension might kick in later on. And so there's these variations in income. Your expenses are the same. So you have to map those out between, now and the end of life. And, obviously the important part there is really focusing on the near term. You want to try to be as accurate as possible, maybe for the next 10 years. And then you have to make some assumptions on what happens beyond that. But some of the variables are, a lot of people in early retirement want to spend more money on travel. They also may be having to spend more money on healthcare premiums if they're not yet on Medicare. And then when they switch to Medicare, their health insurance costs are going to change. So that that concept of life not being linear, those are some of the examples there. Income is going to be variable, expenses are going to be variable, but we want to do the best job we can at making some reasonable estimates there. So that's step number one.
Right. Step two.
Step two is in simple forms. Okay, now we know what spending is going to look like. We do a pretty simple math calculation. Is you take income minus expenses, and what's left over has to come from your portfolio. So in other words, income minus expenses equals portfolio withdrawals. I put together an example for someone that is spending about $10,000 a month to support their retirement and used some living expenses, inflation, used 3%, for medical expenses used 5%, and assuming that they are taking all of their withdrawals from a taxable brokerage account for the early years of retirement. And so to use an income ladder or a bond ladder, sometimes I use those terms interchangeably, what you do is you map out those expected withdrawals and then you start to match bonds or CDs to the expected withdrawals. So kind of really two pieces that you want to start with here is money that you're going to need to spend this year. Say you retired in January and you need to take $10,000 a month from your savings this year. You want that $10,000 a month to be totally liquid, in cash or something similar to cash. So that's the first piece of it is, spending within the next 12 months, you want it to be totally accessible. Cash is a great option. Something to consider right now with interest rates having been on the rise, over the last year. Money that's sitting in cash is losing out on potential interest. So one strategy there is to use something like short-term treasury bills. So maybe you have those that are maturing every 3 months or so to cover your $10,000 a month need. There's an example of that in the article. Beyond the short-term spending in the next year, we can start to implement the bond ladder approach. And so what that looks like is if we assume next year, 2024, you are going to need to take out $123,000 for the year to cover your spending, and the following year a little bit more to account for inflation. We want to start matching bonds to those withdrawals. And so again, there's two pieces that go along with that. So when you're buying individual bonds, the goal for retirement planning is to use both the principal and the interest to support your retirement paycheck. And so if you're buying bonds that are going to mature maybe over the next 8 or 9 years, you are going to use the interest from the bonds and the maturing principal to cover your withdrawal needs. So I think reading through the article provides some really specific examples that would be helpful. But some of the main takeaways with bonds and using them in a retirement portfolio are, what types of bonds? There's a ton. Generally speaking, we like to use government bonds or CDs. So things that are pretty safe. With anything investment related, the safer it is, the lower the return. But again, interest rates have been on the rise lately. So even those safe investments are paying 4 or 5% interest right now, which is really great. So that's key, is we want to use safe investments. The goal of a bond ladder is to make sure the money that you need is there when you need it. It's not a time to take risk. So we're not trying to maximize returns here. We're just trying to make sure that that $120,000 you need for the year is going to be there, regardless of market fluctuations. Um, Something else to know about bonds or CDs when you're using them in a retirement portfolio is both pay interest, but it works a little bit differently. So typically government bonds pay interest every 6 months, and CDs typically pay interest monthly. So the interest is going to come in at different points.
So as you think about this strategy, in order for it to be effective, any thoughts about that?
So in order for it to be effective, I mean, the key is first taking the time to build a plan. You have to know what your withdrawals are to match up the bonds to them. That is definitely step number one. It's also just important to know, conceptually how the strategy works. So the goal of having a bond ladder is so bonds are maturing when you need to spend the cash. I recently went through this process with a client, and we bought the bonds in his portfolio matched up to his withdrawals, and a couple weeks went by and he emailed me and said, hey Amy, I thought the point of the bonds was that they wouldn't go down in value. Mine are down in value. And so that's another important thing to remember, that if you hold a bond to maturity, you get your principal back. That's the goal. That's how we use them in this approach. During the time you're holding the bond, it can fluctuate in value. And I don't remember where I heard this comparison, but I love it. So somebody once explained it that the value of a bond is similar to the Zillow value of your home. If you check Zillow every day, you're going to see that the value of your home fluctuates. Some days it's up, some days it's down. It kind of doesn't really matter unless you decide to sell your house on any given day, and that's the same with bonds. When you buy them for retirement planning, the goal is you hold them till they mature, you get that principal back. In the meantime, the bond value is going to go up and down, just like the value of your home on Zillow. And it doesn't matter unless you decided to sell the bond early. If you sell it early, you might be able to get more than you bought it for. If you also might have to settle for less, but if you hold it to maturity, you get what you get your principal back. And that's really the key to this approach, is develop that comprehensive plan, understand what your withdrawal pattern is going to look like, and then buy the bonds to match with the intent to hold them until they mature. So sounds simple, right?
It sounds simple on paper. A couple questions. You're using CDs and government bonds and treasury bills. Some people might use zero coupon bonds or bullet shares and that sort of thing. Any thoughts about those types of investments to build your ladder?
Yep, those are appropriate too. Like a lot of things with investing, there's always trade-offs, and so sometimes things like bullet shares can make more sense. There's technically slightly more risk with something like that because they're not backed by the government; they're corporate type bonds. And so you can get a slightly higher interest rate with slightly higher risk that you don't have that government backing. But generally speaking, those are appropriate if the retiree is comfortable with the additional risk.
So, oftentimes bond ladders are often referred to as asset liability matching. Is that fair? A fair comparison, Amy?
It is. Yep, that is the kind of technical name for the approach. And a lot of times when I am explaining the approach to people and I talk to them about asset liability matching and what the goal is to match up your investments with your cash flow needs, usually people say, "Wow, that makes a ton of sense. Where did this idea come from? Did your firm come up with it?" And I wish I could say yes, but no. It's been around for a really long time. It's actually something that pension plans have been using for decades. So, if you think back to the traditional way of the world where, you work for the same company for 30 or 40 years, you retire and you get this nice pension. The pension plans knew when people were expected to start their benefits. Pensions start at 65, say. And so the pension plans would manage the investments in a way that aligned with people's expected retirement. So if they knew an employee was going to retire at 65 and start their pension payments, they would have bonds matched up to support that, just like how we do with individual retirees.
Yeah, and in the article, Amy, you mentioned some other ways that people can generate income in retirement. The 4% rule being one of them. It strikes me that one benefit of using the bond ladder or asset liability matching approach is that you take the worry out of what is happening in the marketplace, whether the market is going up or down. You don't necessarily have to worry because you have a stream of income to match your expenses, and it's not dependent on the market.
You are summarizing it perfectly. Generally speaking, when I'm thinking about financial planning decisions, I like to look at them from two angles. The math is important. You want to always make sure that the numbers look good, but possibly the more important of the two angles is how you feel about something. And so, one of the really big benefits of using an income ladder is that emotional stability or the confidence that you have in your retirement plan, because you're exactly right, Bob. You don't have to worry about the market volatility. When you have bonds maturing, strategically to match up to your withdrawals, sure, it still can be really scary on paper to see the value of your investments dropping. But then you go back to, okay, why did we use this bond ladder approach? Oh, yeah, we have these bonds maturing exactly at the point in times we expect to need them, and it does help people generally to enjoy their retirement more because they have less of that financial worry or stress about what their investments are doing.
Yeah. So, Amy, we covered a lot of ground. Anything we missed, or anything that just bears reemphasizing?
Well, I don't think so. I think that covers the bulk of it. And really just, I think the biggest takeaway is making sure that you have a plan that matches what's important to you, and then you tailor the investments to match. And that's what the bond ladder approach does. So it is a really great tool and great approach to use in retirement for those who like the stability and knowing what to expect.